John Barton Gruelle was born in Arcola, Illinois in 1880, the oldest of 3 children, to the respected artist Richard Buckner Gruelle and his wife Alice. In 1882 the family relocated to Indianapolis, Indiana, and as I found no trace of anything he may have created at this time, the images I'm showing here are all from much later. And it appears Gruelle had no formal art education and instead learned the basics of image creation in his father's studio. At 19 years old he met his future wife Myrtle J. Swan in Indianapolis, where they were married in 1901. Marcella, the first of their 3 children, was born in the following year. Unlike his father, it seems Gruelle had little to no ambitions as a fine artist, and throughout the first decade of the new century he created political cartoons and other bits and pieces of humorous monochrome illustration for various Indianapolis newspapers. Among them were examples such as this, which showed a real flair for complicated humorous crowd scenes, a talent he would return to later with great success. But his career in illustration really took off in 1911 when he entered a competition sponsored by the New York Herald Tribune to create a new comic strip, and Gruelle won first and second place. His winning entry, Mr. Tweedledee, became popular enough to be nationally syndicated and ran successfully until 1918. It was a remarkably confident and beautifully rendered fantasy comic strip, which went much deeper into what might be considered classic children's illustrated styles than most of the competition. There were some resonances with Winsor McCay's Little Nemo, but stylistically McCay's strip was much less organic and more formally designed than Gruelle's creation. In the same year, a monochrome comic strip version of Jack the Giant Killer was also published. It only managed a run of 4 issues before being forgotten, and whether it had been the second place strip in the competition I've been unable to discover. In 1914 he made his debut as an illustrator of children's books with his edition of Grimm's Tales. This book was printed in line only from Gruelle's expressive and plausibly traditional pen and ink drawings. His mastery of exaggerated anatomy and use of sophisticated hatching techniques brought the centuries-old Germanic folk tales to credible and absorbing visual life for the young readers. Tragically, in the following year his daughter Marcella died at just 13 years old from an infected smallpox vaccination. And following this terrible loss, the remaining family left for Norwalk, Connecticut, where Gruelle's parents had acquired a large house. It was also in 1915 that he patented his character design for Raggedy Ann, the doll who would soon become his greatest success, even though she had yet to appear in any published work. A year later, Gruelle deviated from his usual generally comic output with an illustrated edition of Hector Mallow's 1898 novel Nobody's Boy, but the results didn't compare favourably with his usual output. But he was back on more familiar terrain with the same year's All About Mother Goose, which was just one of a limited series gathered under the All About banner. And I don't know if the book itself was published in a physically small format, but the images were certainly reproduced quite small, with a half-tone dot screen clearly visible in the cheerful and boldly rendered watercolour images. The Travels of Timmy Toodles was also published in 1916 in 6 separate editions of the popular children's compendium John Martin's book. This was both written and illustrated by Gruelle, and the text and images were combined artfully on the page in a series of engaging and comical pen and ink drawings of considerable merit and graphic solidity. And if that wasn't more than enough for any mortal, it was also in 1916 that his Quacky Doodles character, patented at the same time as Raggedy Ann, first appeared in book form, followed by several others. Although the books are poorly represented online, I did find quite a lot of evidence of the marketing and merchandising connected with this concept, including now highly collectible wooden toys, and some evidence, although not actual footage, of the Bray Studios' 1917 animation of the character and her family. In the same year he returned to the All About series for the story of the Little Small Red Hen, and the book was yet another commercial success. And it was drawn and rendered with conspicuously greater linear and tonally painted sophistication than the earlier Mother Goose collection, even if the print quality still left a lot to be desired. The book My Very Own Fairy Stories, which he also wrote, was also published in 1917. This too featured full-page colour illustrations for each of the stories, which cast a fairly wide net between standard human romantic tales of the past with more comedic anthropomorphic animal scenes. Whatever the subject of any individual illustration, the combination of expressive and tightly controlled line work with saturated washes of bright colour couldn't fail to appeal to children. How Gruelle found time to sleep is a mystery, because 1917 also saw a return to the Brothers Grimm, with a book in the All About series devoted to the story of Hansel and Gretel, which, like the earlier monochrome Grimm's book, successfully evoked the dark forested setting of the tale, despite the bright saturated qualities of his tonally applied watercolour washes. The first of what would quickly become a torrent of Raggedy Ann books was published in 1918. The rather drab cover featured the eponymous heroine but gave away nothing about the delightful narrative or engaging and frequently slapstick nature of the pen and watercolour illustrations contained in its pages. The human element of this book was a little girl named for Gruelle's own departed daughter Marcella, and the various magically brought to life doll characters, with Raggedy Ann as the most central of them, provided the antics and little adventures that kept the children entertained and their parents happy. And it was no surprise that the immense success of this first outing led to the subsequent production of the Raggedy Ann series and its consequent merchandising. Alongside his by now formidable amount of children's illustration, Gruelle also had significant success starting in 1918 with a long-running series of comedic crowd scenes about the goings-on in the fictional backwater Yaps Crossing, which were published for the next few years in the humour magazine Judge. There was this apparently isolated colour cover, but all others were black and white only, not that it was particularly to their detriment. These were remarkably detailed, crowded compositions which could be enjoyed for the longest time by the reader, with small scenarios related to the particular theme of the given image taking place. And although not aimed at children, there was nothing contained in any of these absorbing images that can be considered unsuitable for them. In 1918 he published the funny little book which featured a family of wooden toys executed in an unusually geometric and generally flat colour, or at least as flat as watercolour is capable of. And they reveal yet another facet of his creative imagination and stylistic approach, some considerable distance from his more usual organic image making. And although Gruelle was successful as a writer of his own books and character creations, he also illustrated books written by others, including Sunny Bunny by Nina Wilcox Pullman, which owed a certain debt to the anthropomorphic tales of British illustrator and author Beatrix Potter. And incredibly, this was another which appeared on bookshelves in 1918 alongside the triumphant Raggedy Ann. 1919 saw the publication of two quite similar collections, both of which were also written by Gruelle. Friendly Fairies, as the title suggests, contained an abundance of traditionally styled and tonally rendered woodland fantasy images, which actually seemed to focus more on elves than fairies, but I'm sure his readers were enraptured either way. And precisely the same was true of the same year's publication of Little Sunny Stories, another set of charming and expressively rendered line and wash fantasy scenes. What was particularly striking about all these images was the obvious observational research and attention to detail applied to the background elements, with foliage and trees in particular being every bit as crucial to the image's success as the evocation and antics of the characters. In 1920, Raggedy Andy made his debut, and he remained a constant presence in all the future books in the series. And by this time the books had acquired an ever-growing number of imaginative supporting doll characters, allowing for greater scope for adventure in the written narratives and consequently the illustrations. The Orphan Annie storybook, a direct reference to James Whitcomb Riley's poem of that name, was published in the following year, and usurped the young female protagonist to place her in a series of fantasy scenarios with another collection of evocative scenes populated by a variety of fairy tale characters, all created in full colour line and wash. At this time, Gruelle also contributed illustrated stories which were printed somewhat redundantly as duotones in the pages of Good Housekeeping magazines, for mothers to keep their young offspring occupied and amused. And his endearing characters were placed artfully alongside the text with highly attractive results. It was also in 1921 that he published the story of Eddie Elephant, with the creation of a particularly endearing anthropomorphic character, his mother and a range of others who appeared throughout this amusing, if inconsequential, story. In graphic terms, this was one of his bolder and flatter coloured outings, which made the images ideal for early learners, as we now call them, and it proved to be yet another in an ever-growing line of publishing successes. The same could be said of the following year's The Magical Land of Noom, which saw a return to Gruelle's more traditional and gestural technique. It was a charming absurd fantasy featuring 2 children and a collection of outlandish characters and many impossible scenarios to keep the children amused. And it was obvious that Gruelle relished and was highly adept with the creation of such storytelling and narrative illustration. Johnny Mouse and the Wishing Stick was also published in 1922, another amusing little tale with colour wash illustrations, quite a few of which incorporated black and other dark background work similar to his images for Eddie the Elephant, and some particularly expressive line-only monochromes dotted throughout the text and used as chapter headings. 1922 also saw the publication of a new edition of Grimm's Tales, but in this instance the monochrome line drawings were created by the now very obscure R. Emmett Owen, while Gruelle was given the task of creating a handful of brightly coloured full-page images selected from the various narratives, which were among his most charming and characterful fairy tale images. This time around the colour was particularly intense, and as with other 20th century versions, there was little of the Gothic appeal of the originals on display, however pleasant the images were. The Cruise of the Rickety Robin was originally published sequentially in Woman's World magazine between 1921 and 23, and once it had run its course in the magazine it was compiled in book form, and it too sold in healthy numbers. Throughout the 1920s more Raggedy Ann books were published, with at least one every year, and all continued to be popular, and if anything increasingly so as later crops of youngsters came along who were every bit as entertained as the previous batch of offspring. The merchandise which the success of this series spawned was a whole industry in itself. And in 1929 he published the story Marcella, an obvious tribute to the memory of his late daughter, in which she interacted with Anne, Andy and the other characters in a typically endearing and on occasion rather poignant fashion. It was also in 1929 that he published the book The Cheery Scarecrow, which although it trod familiar narrative territory still possessed some undeniably charming and evocative watercolours, even if it was somewhat overwhelmed by his other achievements of the time. And in that year he launched a far from typical new comic strip featuring a little middle-aged man called Brutus, but although it was a popular strip I struggled to find much evidence of good enough resolution. It seems he was completely unaffected by the Great Depression which followed the Wall Street crash, and he continued to publish more Raggedy Ann books, although by the middle of the decade he was now being assisted by his son Worth. But in 1936 Gruelle began a complex and stressful legal battle over the piracy of his characters, with dolls being made and sold for which he wasn't being paid. In 1937 he emerged the victor, but the strain and anxiety of the fight was surely a significant contributory factor to his death from heart failure in 1938 at the age of just 57. Despite his early departure, Johnny Gruelle managed a career which had lasted for the best part of 4 decades, in which time he authored and illustrated dozens of books and had countless comic strips, cartoons and illustrations published in many newspapers and magazines. Of course, he will always be best remembered as the creator of Raggedy Ann. But to end this video I've put together a compilation from his other achievements which don't get the same level of attention or admiration.